First, Iran is now facing a renewal of UN-mandated sanctions within weeks as France, Germany and the UK say Tehran has willfully abandoned the 2015 nuclear deal. The European countries, known as the E3, offered Iran a delay of the snapback of sanctions during talks in July in exchange for three conditions: resuming negotiations with Washington over its nuclear program, allowing UN inspectors to access its nuclear sites, and accounting for the over 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium the UN watchdog says it has. France 24's Rachel Griffith reports.
Will Europeans reinstate sanctions against Iran? Back in 2018, they decided against it after the US withdrew from the Vienna Agreement. Europe and Iran are now accusing each other of not sticking to their commitments. Western officials have said they suspect Iran has returned to negotiating tactics aimed at buying time and dragging talks out. Discussions broke down in Istanbul in July.
The European parties have been at fault and negligent in implementing the nuclear agreement. Worse still, following the military aggression of the Zionist regime, not only did they refrain from condemning the act, but through certain statements they actually attempted to justify the aggression.
Earlier this summer, Israel launched several attacks on Iranian military sites and assassinated senior military commanders as well as nuclear scientists. While Iran's enrichment plants were badly damaged or destroyed in the 12-day June war, the status and whereabouts of Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium are unclear. Europe is now demanding Iranians return to the negotiating table with the United States, something Tehran has refused.
This issue's unsolvable. The President of the United States wants Iran to obey America's orders. The Iranian nation is deeply offended by such a great insult.
Tehran has also not granted the IAEA access since the Israeli and American bombings, arguing it is not safe for inspectors. While the United States targeted sites in Fordow, Natanz and Isfahan and claimed to have destroyed its sworn enemies' nuclear capabilities, the international community is now wondering what was the real impact of these strikes and where are the stocks of enriched uranium, which some experts believe were moved before the bombings. Negotiations between Tehran and the Europeans last took place in Geneva on the 20th of June, while fighting was still underway. Little progress was reported at the time. Tehran has also warned of a harsh response if sanctions are indeed reinstated.
Well, for more insight on the story, let's bring in Holly Dagres to the program, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute. Holly, great to have you with us. Thank you so much for your time today. First, what's the purpose of the snapback mechanism? Explain to us how this process works.
Well, thank you for having me on the program. So when the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, also known as the nuclear deal, was signed in 2015, in conjunction with it, the United Nations Security Council had a resolution, UN Resolution 2231. In essence, this is a multilateral sanctions regime. And what was written in was that if Iran was to not abide by the terms of the agreement, that the signatories to the JCPOA, which at the time included all 5 world powers plus Germany, could then snap back or reinforce United Nations sanctions. Now, with the U.S. withdrawing from the JCPOA in 2018 under the first Trump administration, the U.S. is no longer has the ability to invoke snapback. So the thing that's happening now is that the remaining E3, Germany, Britain, and France, are the ones that are keen on reimposing the snapback because of Tehran's violating parts of the agreement.
But Iran says there's no legal basis for the Europeans to reimpose UN sanctions because Europeans have not honored their commitments under the accord.
Well, the angle that Tehran is approaching is that they believe that when the U.S. withdrew in 2018, that the Europeans did not help Iran violate or circumvent sanctions at the time. And so that's been a lot of their frustration with the European countries. But technically, they've been holding their sides of the bargain from the get-go. And so if any anger should be directed at anyone, it should be Tehran towards Washington for withdrawing. So I think that's a baseless argument on their part.
So then what kind of impact would reinstated UN sanctions have on Iran and its nuclear program?
Well, for starters, a lot has happened since the original signing of the deal. Because of the U.S. withdrawal in 2018, it had unilateral sanctions reimposed under the Trump administration's maximum pressure strategy. So over the years, the Iranians have had to make adjustments that so that their economy wouldn't be hit as hard by sanctions. That being said, it still has a big impact on the country, especially the rial, which has lost much of its worth over the past 15 years. And so I think what really is going to hurt the average Iranian now is if these snapback sanctions do happen, is that there will be a skyrocketing of the Iranian real, and that will hurt their purchasing power. But to say that it's going to be hurting the economy in other fronts, it will also reimpose an arms embargo on Tehran, impose travel bans, asset freezes. But I think here is just how it's going to impact the ordinary average Iranian. And I think it's really through the purchasing power.
But then how would it impact Tehran's nuclear program specifically?
Well, much of its nuclear program has been heavily damaged during the 12-day war. We're not actually entirely sure the extent of the damage. We've had numerous intelligence assessments, ones that as extreme as President Trump call it, saying that it's been obliterated, but we know that not to be true. But I think that with the Iranians, it will complicate matters if they decide to rebuild. And we're not entirely sure if they're already doing that because it's some of what's been buried deep underground. And so I guess time will tell what they're actually doing with their nuclear program.
And would it be possible to then repeal the sanctions at the UN level?
So what's interesting about these sanctions is that it was written in that there is no veto power, but the reason that the Europeans are very keen on snapping back sanctions at the end of this month is because it takes 30 days for this process to happen. But in October, when actually the sanctions inability to snag back would run out, is also when Russia will head the United Nations Security Council as president. Now, because that veto of power has been removed, it doesn't mean that Russia can't complicate matters and delay the process. And so that's been some of the worry of European diplomats. And given that Russia is an ally of Tehran, it seems very likely that they would do something like that.
And then what could an Iranian response to the snapback of sanctions look like? And is there any hope for a diplomatic solution once that is triggered?
Well, there was a diplomatic solution today, and the readout, it seems, from Geneva is that Iran really hasn't decided to actually make some concrete offers that would satisfy the Europeans, because that's basically what the Europeans have been wanting. They've been wanting access to the nuclear facilities. They've been wanting a push for talks, and that was seemed to be the readout from reports so far, that the Iranians hadn't been able to deliver on that. That said, we've also heard the Iranian foreign minister later today say that that Tehran would be open to indirect talks with the United States. But I think the issue here is now, is Washington interested in indirect talks with Tehran? Because in the eyes of President Trump himself, the program has quote unquote been obliterated. So it's really not been an important file for him since the war ended on June 24th. So I think that these are two countries that are at this point talking past one another.
Holly Dagres from the Washington Institute, thank you very much for your analysis and for your time today.